Okay, here we go. So we're going to do the Great Depression. I'm going to go pretty fast through this stuff. It's a shorter unit for us, but certainly one that's going to be important. I'm going to try to approach this topic from two vantage points. Really a positive of the New Deal and FDR and sort of where he's coming from as president, and then of course talk about some of the criticisms that FDR faced. And I'm hoping that you'll get a balanced approach to this, and you can do your own history and own research as to where you stand on this stuff. It's meant to make you think, but certainly meant to give you a basic idea of how certain things work within the New Deal. So here we go. Coming out of the Great Depression, we need to understand, or we need to know a little bit about FDR, who he was, where he's coming from, that kind of stuff. And so I always start out with a nice story talking about young FDR. He grew up in Springwood Estate, which is beautiful. If you ever name a house, if you ever see a house named, it's probably a really nice house. It's probably a very expensive house, and that's what Springwood was. He grew up, FDR did, with his nose up a little bit. He was rich. He was a Roosevelt. He didn't have to work for a whole lot. That doesn't mean that he wasn't successful or anything like that, but he just certainly didn't have to suffer the way some families do or did. And so for that, FDR, his young upbringing, I don't think made him ready for presidency, but something will. FDR was out one day and he was sailing. Now, he's sailing with his yacht. He's out there and he's having a really good time. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you ever swam for most of a day, 4, 5, 6 hours or longer, right? Not only is your skin really, really pruny, but of course, you're really, really, really tired. And so FDR comes home, and his wife at the time, Eleanor, just like his fifth cousin, and you can replay that back. That's kind of, a little weird. But anyway, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat down, and he was ready to be served his meal. He was ready to eat, and he felt really, really, really sore. And he was like, you know what, I can't eat. Just not feeling up to it, so I'm going to go upstairs. And so he did. He went upstairs, he walked up those stairs, and it was the last time that he'd ever walk again. He woke up, and his legs, he couldn't really feel them. And it was like his mind was telling his legs, move, please move. But his body wasn't moving. And so FDR screams down to Eleanor, and of course Eleanor runs up the stairs, and she's like, what's going on? What's the matter, He says, Eleanor, I cannot move my legs. I can't even feel them. And so the doctor comes much later, and the doctor checked him out, and he said he had this thing called polio. It's a disease that was all too common back during the 20s and 30s. And the condition was that polio, it destroys the muscle fibers in your legs. It attacks your muscles. And of course, it attacked FDR's muscles really badly. And so he couldn't walk. Now, FDR is in a position here where he is grieving. And, first he was really, really sad, and he would just, lay in bed. And then over time he said, no, I'm going to deny this. I don't want polio to defeat me. It won't defeat me because I can overcome it, right? And maybe that was a fruitless endeavor, but certainly he didn't believe so. And Eleanor Roosevelt would later write how he would get his leg braces, and he'd get some crutches. And he'd go outside, and he'd go to the long driveway that they had, and he would start to ever so slightly walk up and down that driveway. Now, it would take him all day, because he's only moving like a step at a time, and he's not truthfully walking. He's trying, of course, but it didn't seem to change any. And so FDR tried to beat this thing. He's realizing he couldn't. He would lay in bed. Eleanor would leave, grocery shopping, hanging out with her girlfriends, whatever. And he'd be laying in bed, and he'd start to hyperventilate because he was so afraid that his house would catch on fire. Because if it did, first he'd smell it, right? And then he'd start to feel the warmth, and then eventually the flames would be upon him, and there was nothing he could do that whole time. So he had this like really, really, really big fear of fire. And you've got to understand that in the 1920s and 30s, fires are a heck of a lot more common than maybe they are right now. So it was really something that was on his mind. Now, FDR could have just, either kept lying in bed or kept denying his condition, but ultimately he came to accept it, as grieving does. And he accepted it, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to let it defeat me. I struggle with polio. I am in a wheelchair, but it will not defeat me as a person, me as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so he eventually is going to run in New York City politics, and then later he is going to run for the office of president. And what I want you to know is that, while people were suffering, eating what they called Hoover stew, which is, you go out into your backyard and you just pull a bunch of weeds together, a couple pine cones, whatever. You throw a bunch of stuff together in some water, and you call it Hoover stew, and you boil it up. Or when people are leaving their pockets empty, they're taking their pockets and reversing them out. They're flying the Hoover flag. Or the fact that Hoovervilles are popping up, and I'll talk about those later, these cardboard sort of villas that are popping up, that these awful places where people are living. FDR is doing what Herbert Hoover won't do, which is he is promising that he is going to help the people. In fact, he gets up in front of people and he says, I am going to give you a new deal. He says, I'm not going to forget about you. I am not going to allow the laissez-faire politics of the 1920s to stop me from helping you. He says, if you need a job, I'll find you one. If your family needs to eat, I will find them food, right? If you need some money, the government, the federal government will help you. He said, just know, I know what it's like to struggle. I know what you're going through, and I'm not going to leave you behind. And that was precisely the language that people wanted to hear. Maybe what they needed to hear during the Great Depression. Okay? Now, a really interesting thing about FDR was that he never wanted to be photographed in front of the media. He didn't want to appear weak. You see, the culture of America was not so forgiving, and what people may have called him, what they would have referred to him as, was a cripple. And that's an awful, ugly, ugly word that we don't use anymore. But back then they did, and he didn't want people to see him that way. He wanted people to see him as the strong, courageous man that he was. Okay? And so he would ask the press not to photograph him in his wheelchair. And it's really hard, not easy, to find pictures of him in a wheelchair precisely because of that, because the press was a little bit more respectful back then than maybe it is today, and you can make your own judgments about that. But there is a later, much later picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt there. And so, FDR is going to have many different sides of the aisle. Some people love him, some people hate him, and again, today is about giving you a balanced approach to FDR's struggle, okay? Now, to begin today, now that you have a little background on FDR, I want you to know a couple of things about the Great Depression. And I balanced them out into a couple of different causes. We can use STOCK as our acronym to make sure that we remember them all. And the first, of course, is the stock market crash of 29. The stocks plummet. Things are bad. Now, I will argue that the reason why the stock market crash is worse is not just because it doesn't just affect the people who went out and bought stocks. Yes, it does. Okay, stock borrowers or lenders, definitely, right? People who engage in the stock market get hurt. But those people, many of them, went to banks, took money out on loans, and then went to the stock market. Okay? They take that borrowed money and they put it and invest it into the stock market. Now, when things are good, wow, they're making tons of money, right? But when things are bad, like 1929, it's not only the people who bought stocks that are hurt. It is the people who try to save money in the banks as well, right? Because those stock brokers, those people who are out there, and I use air quotes here, gambling in the stock market, right? Those people, they lose their money, but really the people who put their money in banks also lose their money too, because the banks had loaned this money out, okay? So when people come to the banks and they're like, where are my life savings? Where is the money I put away from my house? The banks are like, we loaned it out to people who gamble on the stock market, okay? Not a good look, not very good in it. And so this is a double-pronged effect. It doesn't just hurt the risk takers, it hurts the people who had tried to do the right thing as well, okay? Make sure you understand that. Second, there is a phenomenon here called trickle-down economics that I think needs to be talked about. You can also call it supply-side economics, and I will totally talk about that when we talk about Ronald Reagan. Introducing the concept, okay, because I think that these words, it makes it easy to understand. Herbert Hoover's idea, laissez-faire, right? Government hands-off. He talks about the invisible hand, right? The idea that people and the market will fluctuate, but ultimately let the people do its work, right? Let the economy be on its own. Government stay out. Herbert Hoover also starts to get this idea that if big business is doing really well, if you help out big business by giving them maybe tax breaks or really just letting them go, in some cases, he says that the big businesses will pass on their profits to their workers. Now, I talk to this about my students. Sometimes this works and sometimes this doesn't. If this is your only policy during the Great Depression, it's probably not going to do enough to help people immediately. Okay? So, trickle-down economics, know what it is, and I think it'll serve you well going forward in American history. Overuse of farmland. People, particularly American farmers, started to use their land at a rapid pace. Now, if you recall, way back during feudal times, we had this idea called the crop rotation system, right? That you would use maybe 3 of your fields and leave the 4th field fallow. You wouldn't put anything there. You might let the animals graze in that field, let them drop manure in that field, okay? Let that field replenish its nutrients. During the 1920s, remember this is a fast, loose, living in the moment kind of time period. People are trying to make the most money they can, and so they're using all of their farmland. Well, when you use all of your farmland at a rapid pace, and then you get a little bit of drought mixed in there, right? You've overused your soil, and then you get a drought. You get all of that topsoil that is becomes this dusty, unusable stuff, and a little bit of winds in the Great Plains, and you have a recipe for some horrible disasters. See the picture in the bottom left there where a car is totally overblown by dust, and we call that the Dust Bowl, of course. We've talked about credit buying a little bit. I'll just say this. Consumer goods are also being bought on credit. Things like refrigerators, things like washer machines, things like cars particularly, right? The idea is under credit, I can make payments on something, but I can have it immediately. So I can get that car immediately, show it off to my neighbors, right, while at the same time making payments on it. Okay, so I'm driving around in the car, I'm making payments on it. Now, credit buying can work really well. Somebody who doesn't have enough upfront cash can have the ability to have a car so they can get to their job and be on time and not have to take public transportation. Those are things that are appealing to consumers, right? But on the other side of that, if you don't make those payments or you run out of money, a la the stock market crash, then those factories who have loaned out or given all of these products away, they're not making enough money now, right? Because if you're not paying them, they're not making money. So credit buying, maybe in the short term, really awesome. And people start to buy up a lot of things on credit. And then they get the bills later and they realize that they cannot afford it. And again, when the stock market hits and crashes, okay, this is a recipe for disaster because of all those things that are bought on credit. People don't have the money to eventually pay them off. Okay, so these all sort of build one another. And last one, it's sort of a stretch as far as acronyms go, but I'm saying this, keeping production too high. That is that factories continue to produce a lot of stuff. For example, during the 1920s 1920s, people, it's all the rage to go out and get yourself a nice new washing machine, right? And so people are out there, they're buying stuff, they're going out there and they're buying consumer goods. But if those factories continue to produce at such a high level, I mean, eventually, people don't need, 5 washing machines, right? They only need 1. And when the stock market crashes, they can't even afford 1. So these factories that have produced so many goods end up kind of overproducing them. And eventually the demand runs out, but there's a high supply, right? And that supply just sits there in those factories and it just rots away, right? These factories aren't making enough money. And of course, when factories don't make money, they don't need as many employees. And then you see how this thing can start to really get bad. By the way, we call the advent of the Dust Bowl the first day, right, where this stuff really starts to pour through. We call it Black Sunday. And with my students, I like to do a little simulation where they live through this stuff. But for now, suffice it to say that the Dust Bowl happened. It ruined the lives of farmers. It had some long-term effects with brown fever, where people are swallowing up all that dust in the air. It's not good. It destroys houses. And of course, now the farmland's not usable. It's an ecological disaster for America. Now, this is something I teach my students to know. And this is not to say this is the only way to understand economics. And I'm sure in 12th grade you're going to learn a ton about economics. I'm breaking it down. And I'm trying to be simple in doing so, while making sure that I do justice to economics. And so the way that I teach economics in a basic sense is there are 3 legs to a traditional economy. The first leg is the factory orders. That is, factories make stuff, right? In an economy, you have factories. They are creating things like, let's say, a car, right? And they're going out, and making these cars. And because of that, because factories have orders, because people want to buy things, right? Those factories need to give people jobs. So jobs is the second leg of the triangle. So first would be factory orders. The second leg of the triangle would then be jobs. And so people go to work. They work for those factories, and everything's going good. And of course, if you have any job, you always, hopefully, want to be paid for your work, right? You want to make money. So money is the third leg of the triangle. And so you've got these factory orders that are producing goods. These factories need to employ people, so they have to give jobs to people. As part of those jobs, they make money, right? The workers make money, and the workers then take that money, and they need to buy things that are made at factories. And so the triangle sort of works together with one another. However, think back to the stock market crash. When the stock market crashes, and it's not just the investors in the stock market that lose money, but also the people who had put their savings into banks, right? When they lose their money, when those people lose money and the banks are no longer trustworthy, money is gone, right? Take money out of the pyramid, or at least take a lot of it out. What starts to happen is when people don't have money, they don't buy things that are at a factory, right? Because they don't buy things that are at a factory, now the factory doesn't need to hire as many people, right? And so there's less money in the economy because now you don't have to pay people as much. And it's sort of this awful negative economic cycle that develops. And it's all because of these 3 legs of the triangle. Factory orders, jobs, money. And if I asked you which leg of the triangle was the one to be broken down, it would certainly be money, right? Money is the thing that breaks down in our triangle, okay? Now, some things to know about the crash. First, Herbert Hoover is the president that oversees this crash. He is a 1920s president in the sense that he is all about laissez-faire, right? And Hoover believes that ultimately the economy is going to correct itself. That's what he thinks. Like, ultimately, don't worry about it. It's going to get better. We've had recessions in the past. Things have gotten bad before. Just let it go, let laissez-faire, it will fix itself. So that's his belief. His underlying assumption, okay, what he thinks might happen, if he goes out and he helps the people, by giving them, let's say a relief check like FDR will do. He says that will destroy individual initiative. Meaning, if you give people money, okay, or if you give them a job, or if you give them food, what you will do is you will teach them that the government will bail them out. And it will make people lazier because they can rely on the government for support as the quote-unquote safety net. Okay? So he is worried about that. Now, I don't care where you stand on that sort of debate right now. That's not really the goal of this lecture. The goal is just for you to understand where Hoover is coming from. Even if you disagree with him, I do need you to know where he's coming from. Okay? All right, moving on. We've talked about this quite a bit. If you don't know what I mean by people losing their life savings and the negative economic cycle that's created, go back and listen. I need you to understand that people who put their money in banks lost out just as badly, maybe if not worse, than those people who had invested their money in the stock market. Okay? Got to know that. I also make the point that African Americans are going to struggle as racism is still alive in this country and well in the 1930s. It is that African Americans are at about double the unemployment rates compared to white Americans. They are struggling with discrimination, and they are still, as African Americans have poured to the north as part of that great migration. Now they're in the north, and they're realizing that there are some problems in the north as well. And when the Great Depression hits, and they don't need African Americans in the factories as much, and they start cutting African American jobs, it becomes a real problem. Okay, and those percentages are to help you understand the type of unemployment rates that existed. Okay, 38% is a ridiculous number. Okay, by the way, you able to tell me why that bread line's really ironic? Take a look, because it is a very ironic photo, to say the least. Okay. We do a little bit about Hoovervilles and hobos when we talk about the simulation that I do in class, but to sort of summarize, a Hooverville, these are named after President Hoover, of course. This is a term to show anger towards President Hoover. People couldn't afford homes. They lost their homes. They couldn't make the mortgage payments, and so they built these shanty towns, and then people would just sort of come together. There was one in the middle of New York City, in Central Park, where people just put cardboard together, a little bit of tin, maybe you have some burlap, and you put it all together, and you make yourself a makeshift house. Not pretty. It's just to survive, pretty much. And these are the places that are popping up, and this sort of speaks to why the people need some help, right? Americans shouldn't have to live like this, right? Or at least that's what the American dream tells us. So they don't look like good places to live because they weren't. And some people could deal with that and hold in and hunker down with their family, and some people couldn't. Some people decided to ride the rails, live life as a hobo. Now, some people say this is, a free life. This is everything that America is about. You can, sort of living on the fly, right? I say it's about escapism. This is a tough life that people have to live during the Depression, and some people could power through it, and other people couldn't. And so they're trying to escape their problems by riding the rails, by not, paying for their ticket, and just hopping on there and going west and trying to make it. Railway companies would hire these guys called bulls to go after the hobos, and it was this back and forth, and the hobos were killed, and just horrible stuff, right? I also want to make the point that a lot of adult men left their families to ride the rails as hobos because they were so embarrassed by not being able to provide for their families, and what that does to a man's psyche. I can't begin to sort of understand. And I'm not trying to explain away what they did. It's wrong. You don't leave your family behind. But many people did. A lot of men did. Okay? So this is a lifestyle that epitomizes the escapism that existed in the 1930s. Okay? In addition to this, we'll see movie watching spike during the 1930s as people are trying to escape their problems. We'll also see women staying at home and watching what we call soap operas, okay, where there's these outrageous stories that women can watch and they can say, oh my gosh, at least my life isn't as crazy as that. And just a side note to that all, the soap operas are named that because the commercials were often with laundry soaps because they knew women were watching during the day, and so they tried to advertise to their audience. Okay, so escapism is something that you should be aware of that is occurring in the 30s because people's lives were so difficult. They wanted something else. Here's a nice Norman Rockwell painting of the hobo lifestyle that sort of develops in the 1930s. And by the way, guys, some people do choose it, some people certainly didn't, but it is something I want you to be aware of. When I searched hobo and dog painting, because I was looking for this one, I ended up getting something that looked like that. So I always think that's kind of funny. So there's the hobo dog, pretty cute. Okay, now if you still don't understand why people went and chose FDR over Herbert Hoover, then I've got one more thing for you, and hopefully this will make it really, really concrete and really, really clear. Okay? To me, this is embarrassing. As an American citizen, I don't like this event. It shouldn't have happened. The veterans of World War I wanted to get paid. Throughout the 1920s, they wanted to get paid. Long story short, Europe had not been paying us as much money as we needed, and we were waiting for these payments and waiting for these payments, and of course this is a worldwide depression. Europe is suffering, and because Europe's suffering, they're not making the payments. So we say, veterans, hold on. Veterans, hold on. And veterans finally said, enough's enough. We gave blood over there in the Argonne Forest in 1917, right? We were fighting over a Chateau theory. We felt like we fought valiantly, and we want to be treated with respect, but we also want to make sure that we are paid for our service. And guys, I agree with them. You should have paid them, but we didn't. So the bonus army, as they are called, they wanted their bonuses. They came to Washington, D.C. They demanded their payments. And here's what Herbert Hoover decided to do. He took a man who was a hothead, I think I'm safe in saying that, and a guy by the name of Douglas MacArthur. Okay, I say hothead because of what he does, or what he tries to do during the Korean War. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up Douglas MacArthur in the Korean War. Okay, guy loses it. MacArthur is tasked with getting the bonus army out. So he does what maybe MacArthur sort of gonna be known for: a little bit of violence, a little bit of brutality. He goes over the edge a little. He puts tear gas out on the bonus army, uncalled for. He uses bayonets, and that's how he splits up this bonus army. He uses tear gas, he uses bayonets, and then he really loses himself because he goes into their Hooverville, right, where they are staying, and he burns it up. He sets it ablaze. Okay. And many citizens are outraged. They're like, how could you, Herbert Hoover, put this guy in power, in control, and let him do that, right? Even if Herbert Hoover didn't tell him to do that, right? Even if he never told Douglas MacArthur, use tear gas and bayonets. It's like, how could you let that happen anyway, right? So either you knew about it and you're a terrible president for it, or you didn't know about it and I'm mad because of your ignorance, right? Either way, I'm mad at President Herbert Hoover. For many citizens, this is outrage. This is wrong. We don't treat our veterans that way, okay? So, I hope that this illustrates why people are not going to vote for Herbert Hoover. They're not doing it. They're voting for FDR. He's promising them help, but he's making sure he ain't a part of this, right? He's not associating himself with this. And this really hurts Herbert Hoover. So in 1932, it's not even close. It's a landslide victory for FDR. He wins, and he's going to sit up there, and he's going to promise. He's going to say, I'm going to give you a New Deal. And I'm going to make sure that the government intervenes in the economy. Right? The government's going to step up. And you're going to see that the federal power increases. If there's one thread throughout this entire lecture you got to know is that under the New Deal, federal power is going to go up. Okay? Know it. And this New Deal is based on what TR used to call the Square Deal. And during the Square Deal, we have Teddy Roosevelt, who has increased his power. Using the federal government through efforts like trust busting and conservation, where the federal government's taking more control in the economy and in sort of the daily life of Americans are starting to step up. Now the New Deal is going to take it to another level. Okay, so he's building on the Roosevelt legacy, if you will. The way that I teach this, and I know that historians do it differently, they have their other methods. They'll do like a first New Deal and a second New Deal, or an early New Deal and a late, and all that kind of stuff. I like this because it simplifies the core concepts, while at the same time it does allow for some blending. And so the 3 R's of the New Deal, the first is relief. Okay, that is, you're going to get people food. You're going to get them jobs, you might get them housing, you certainly are going to get them some money, some cash to take care of their families. Okay, so programs that deal with these sort of basic needs of people are called relief programs. Relieve them, right? Help them out in the immediate. Okay. The next set is called recovery. And recovery is about helping businesses, yes, and helping the farming industry that is being decimated by the Dust Bowl. And so certain programs are going to be designed and geared for the recovery aspect. Fix the economy, in other words. And how do you do that? Well, through business and through farming, right? The two sort of major aspects of the American economy during the 30s. So, last thing is FDR saying, well, that's good if I can, relieve the people. And that's great if I can, fix up the farming in big business industries, and if I can do that, he says, you know what? I want to make sure that nobody ever feels like this again. And so he comes up with these reform programs. He says, I'm going to make sure that my programs make sure that this thing we call the Great Depression never happens again. At least he's going to try, right? So those are the 3 R's. I just want you to know that some programs sort of bleed into 2 R's, like some could be considered recovery and relief or at the same time. But this is a general sort of way of looking at the New Deal, and I think that it categorizes it well. Okay, so you've got your 3, and I'll try to categorize them as I go through. Now, what FDR does is he creates this alphabet soup of programs. So every program I talk to you about, it's got this like long name. He shortens it down. So the first one would be the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. But you get tired of saying that, right? So we call them the FERA offices, okay? F-E-R-A. And the idea is you stand in line, you fill out some basic paperwork, and you're going to get some money to help your families. And the way that I sort of use an analogy for is that the FARA offices are similar to the modern day welfare office. It's not the same thing. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to say the same kind of idea, where you go in there and you're waiting in line, and eventually you're going to get some basic help for your family. Okay? In this case, the FARA offices would just give cash benefits to people so that they could go out and buy food. Okay? So those are the FARA offices, and those would be a part of relief. The AAA is a program. I spend a lot of time talking about what the AAA does. Essentially, to boil it down, it tells farmers that you must not grow certain crops, okay? Because if everyone is growing wheat, right? If everyone is growing it, the price of wheat will go down because there's so much flooding the market. What FDR does is he says, I'm going to tell you really, not to grow wheat, okay? I'll let one farmer grow wheat, and everybody else, I need you to grow something else. And so he'll tell each farmer what to grow. We need soybeans for the country. We need corn for the country. We need potatoes for the country, right? And everybody's got a certain crop that they're going to grow. And what he would do, because, farmers who've been growing wheat for generations don't necessarily want to stop growing wheat. So he would give them a subsidy. He would give them some cash to make up the difference. So instead of everyone making $1 a bushel for growing wheat, what he would do is he would spread money across so that everyone, regardless of what they are making or growing, are going to make the same amount per bushel. So everyone with subsidies will end up making $4 a bushel, right? So everybody makes more, and the federal government has stepped in, told you what to produce, right, but paid you for that. So, right, students say, oh, it sounds like a command economy, right? And it's like, kind of, but he's also paying you to follow along this command economy, so it's a little bit different. And from FDR's perspective, he's like, well, this is what's best for the country at the time, and if you all just keep competing with yourselves, you're never going to get out, right? So let us give you some direction, let us give you some guidance. And of course, it's all up to interpretation, guys. The TVA is a good one to know, the Tennessee Valley Authority. In Tennessee Valley, there was decay. There was roads that were awful. Sometimes there weren't any roads, and what FDR says is, I don't want just the cities to benefit from the New Deal. He says, I want the rural people of America to benefit as well. I want to give jobs to rural America and urban America. He says, I want to improve the infrastructure, not just of the cities, right? But I want to improve the infrastructure of rural America. That'll be good for us long term. And so he gives jobs to people to get them working, but at the same time for the national goal of improving our infrastructure. And if you're wondering what infrastructure is, we're talking like roads and bridges, things that allow you to sort of move within your country easily and accessibly. Okay, the TVA would be a part of a relief program, right? Because we're really, really centered on giving jobs. Whereas the AAA would be a recovery program. This one's one that I really like, and most students really understand the value of this. I think this is one that we even want, come back, please. We call it the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that has some local roots for sure at Gilbert Lake. But the goal is get 18 to 24-year-olds working. Kids who come out of high school that don't have skills, get them out there, get them building parks, bridges, and stone walls. I mean, sometimes, the CCC boys, they would just build a stone wall. They'd say, get out there, I want this stone wall to go, east, and I want you to just keep going until 4 o'clock or whatever. And it would just build. Now, the interesting thing about the CCC was that while it was part of conservation and really carries on this, Roosevelt legacy, right? On the other hand, these boys are being trained like the military. So they are learning how to march, learning how to follow orders, right? Learning what it takes to be ordered. And, some people argue, the CCC is, teaching them to be, not just young men, but trying to get them to be grown men, right? Teaching them responsibility and all those kind of things. And, they lived in military barracks. It was very much, soldier-esque in terms of their lifestyle. And the difference is that, after this, once the CCC is in effect, and then on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor occurs, the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. And it is these CCC boys whom are trained already in many of the ways of a soldier. But I always tell my students, they put down their shovel and they pick up a gun. But they know, sort of the order. They know what it's like to drill. They know what it's like to wake up early and, go to bed early, right? They know those things. And so it's an easier transition from civilian life to the soldier life because of the program of the CCC. And so what Roosevelt finds is that he's already got a mass of young men that he can mobilize rather quickly. Okay, so the CCC contributes to that. It contributes to having a ready fighting force. You still have to arm them. You still have to get them ready in terms of the military. But from a sort of training perspective, a lot of the groundwork is done for you. Okay, so I think this is a really important program for that. So these are the soldiers of World War II. Okay. Another program that's going to, this one really, really impacts your life. So in your bank, and please do, go to KeyBank or go to Community Bank or go wherever bank you go to, and you'll see signs for the FDIC. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, their primary purpose is to make sure that you feel confident putting money in a bank, okay? And so what they did is they guaranteed that up to $250,000 of your money that you put into a bank will be protected by the federal government. Essentially, the federal government says, we back your $250,000. You know, if this bank goes under, we will pay that, okay? You are guaranteed that money, okay? What that does for people is it says these banks aren't going to go down, but if they do, the federal government will make sure to protect you, right? So the FDIC is big because it gets people to put money back into the banks and therefore put money back into the economy because these banks had been closed up, right? So getting people back, putting their money back in banks is a big deal. He also creates the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Again, another one that's around in your lives today, with the goal of putting regulations on the stock market. This thing got out of control, so you can't be speculating, buying stocks on credit. It's just not okay, right? You have to have your money. You put up your money. Don't put up somebody else's money, right? Make sure that this thing called the stock market, this legalized gambling thing that has sort of been created. Make sure that you're doing it with your money. You're not risking somebody else's. And I think that as a common sense measure, I think we can all sort of agree and rally behind that. Or at least I hope you could. Social Security, another one. Something that is in your life. The Social Security Act of 1935 it's contentious in some ways, but it is something that guarantees that you will have some sort of retirement. Or at least that's what people are hoping for. The idea is your checks, you pay a little bit into Social Security, okay? Whatever, $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, right? You're putting a little bit of money into this Social Security fund. And over time, when you get to the retirement age of 65, the government says you can collect a Social Security check. So all that money that you've been paying in, now you'll get a little bit out, okay? Here's why this was enacted. It used to be that if you didn't get a pension from your job, if your job didn't guarantee you some sort of retirement program, you relied on your kids, okay? And if your kids didn't have money, then you were really in a bad place because now you have no retirement, okay? And so you either have to keep working or, I don't know, I'm not really sure what you would do if you didn't have that. It put people in a really bad situation. And so what the government said is, we're going to put Social Security in place so that the elderly will have something guaranteed to them, some sort of income. And that's not to say that you shouldn't save your money. It's just to say that you'll have a little bit of something to fall back on. Now, other people say Social Security is telling me to save my money. Why in America am I being told what to do, right? And so not everybody agrees with it. And there's also something you should know. Some people think that the Social Security fund will run out. It's a real concern that Americans have to this day, and they're thinking that maybe they will raise the retirement age to 67, and a lot of this has to do with, guys, that it used to be that people weren't expected to live to 65. So you weren't supposed to actually ever, majority of the population would never actually see the Social Security check because they wouldn't make it to that age. But now, we're living longer, we're living better, and so Social Security is starting to be a real problem because people are living to 65. They are collecting benefits. And it's certainly a problem for our generation and generations to follow. And like all these programs, it's criticized as socialist because it's not pure capitalism. It's not pure laissez-faire for sure. It's certainly the government intervention aspect. I show a quick movie trailer for Cinderella Man. I think it's a really good movie. If you're interested in any of this stuff and you want to see what a fair office looks like, or you want to see, a man that's down in the dumps and really going through the Great Depression, and it's really not his fault. I mean, the guy breaks his hand in a boxing match trying to provide for his family, and he comes back swinging, and it really is. It's a powerful movie, and it's just the story of the rise, the fall, the rise again of America. I show it to you in class if I could, but I really just don't have a lot of time. So now, I'm almost done. I want to end with some criticism. So if I've been, very positive about the New Deal, I'm going to kind of be a little bit more negative. So in this political cartoon, on the right, you've got FDR, okay? And he has got in front of him a packed court that is a bunch of Supreme Court justices that are supposed to look like, can you guess what they're supposed to look like? Give you a second. You got it. Puppets on a string, okay? They're supposed to be yes men. They're supposed to be people who absolutely just follow FDR 100%. You see, FDR had this New Deal legislation in place, and he's putting it through, and Congress is supporting him on this, right, because they want to get reelected, and he, of course, wants to make sure that his legislation is getting pushed through. And then the Supreme Court says, wait, you can't tell these people to, save their money, for example, Social Security, or you don't have the right to go out there and tell farmers what to grow and give them subsidies. You don't have the right to do that. It doesn't say that in the Constitution. And FDR is like, getting hit every step of the way. He's like, oh my gosh, I want to help these people. I want my New Deal legislation to get pushed through. And so what he decides to do is, and he goes a little far on this, he tries to put more Supreme Court justices, I believe 2 more Supreme Court justices on to break the split so that he can push through everything that he wants. Because if he has a few more Supreme Court justices that support him and his policies, then every single time he is questioned as his New Deal goes through, the court will vote in favor of him, right? And that through majority, all of his decisions can get pushed through. He won't get anyone saying that his New Deal is unconstitutional. Now, if that sounds a little bit like a dictatorship where you just, push through all this legislation and push through all these laws and everyone says yes, yes, yes to you, you're right. It does sound like a dictatorship. It does sound like one man having too much power. And I think FDR, starts to overstep a little. And I think that, maybe he thought he was doing it in a unique way, and maybe he thought he was doing it for a good purpose, but ultimately he's violating checks and balances, right? And so we look at this plan, and Republicans, they hated it, right? But he does this because he wants to pass through that New Deal legislation. And we call it the court packing plan, or the court packing scheme, right? Whereby he's going to increase the amount of justices on the Supreme Court so that he can push through any legislation in the New Deal no matter what. Okay. Other things that he should be criticized for, or that he has been criticized for, is that FDR did not step down after the 2 terms. So normally the way it works, 2 terms, you're done. That is a precedent that goes all the way back to George Washington. Some people, wanted George Washington to keep going and keep, running the country because many people thought he's really good at it, right? But he didn't. He stepped down. And people expect that the president steps down. It's just an expectation that they had. It's part of what we call the unwritten Constitution. It's not, nobody ever, sort of wrote it down until the 22nd Amendment, of course, but nothing was ever written down that you had to. And so FDR said, well, it's not written down. I'll go and run again. And if the people vote for me, then okay, I should be president, right? They vote for me, I go in. And here's the other thing about this that I think you should just understand. Even if you don't, like that FDR did this, you need to understand that as he's running for his 3rd and eventually his 4th term, he's doing this in the spirit of there's a war, or there's an impending war, right? Called World War II. Especially during his 4th term, he said, listen, our country is at war with Adolf Hitler, right? Our country is in a position where we are fighting Imperial Japan. And therefore, a switch in power, a switch of the guard when we are fighting such a devastating conflict is going to make us weaker. And so he runs that 4th term, and people vote for him, right? And he says, listen, if they vote for me, okay, I should be president, but I think it's safer for me to be president given the fact that we were at war, okay? So there's sort of the logic that's going on at the time, and that's not to make you agree with it. We recognize that after FDR did this, that we need to put term limits on the president. We needed to write it down, okay? And we certainly will. Okay, large effects of the New Deal. First, okay, the Wagner Act. collective bargaining is going to be guaranteed under FDR. He was a big proponent in letting workers battle it out with bosses over their contract and ultimately come to an agreement. He, didn't want striking. Striking is not good for anybody because there's no production, right? There's no production. There's this anger between bosses and workers, right? He says, okay, get everyone at the table, bargain collectively, work it out, do a contract, go back and forth, hire an arbiter, right? Do that whole process. So it's called the Wagner Act. You should know it. It has to do with collective bargaining. It could be, very well could be, a question on the Regents exam. Second, gotta know it. Say it a million times. I don't care what you gotta do. Just know that the New Deal legislation increases the power of the federal government. Rarely will I ever say that your federal government's power decreases, okay? In this case, it goes up. The federal government becomes stronger as part of the New Deal. It has to, right? They are going out there and they're doing so many of these programs. The FDIC, the CCC, the AAA, all of these different programs are coming out. And the federal government's power is going up through the roof, really. It is taking on a huge role in the American economy and in the American social sort of stratosphere, if you will. Also, taxation is going to go up, but maybe you should write this in your notes, that taxation is increased on the rich. That they are having to pay more money to fund these New Deal programs. And FDR is going to increase taxation on the rich to make sure that the poor have a way to make it through the Great Depression, and so that he can pay for many of these programs. The other way that he's going to pay for this New Deal legislation is he's going to borrow money. He's going to raise the national debt. And people get very angry over this, that FDR, the debt, skyrocketed under FDR, and people are, really criticizing him. How could you do that, right? And other people say, listen, he had to do what he had to do to get people working again, and he had to do what he had to do to make people get through the Great Depression. Again, there's two sides to look at this, and I think acknowledging the other side is important as well. And last but not least, you will have many historians, many, who will say, yes, the New Deal helped a little bit, right? It pushed, got some people back to work, right? CCC was good, but the other side of it is we weren't moving out of the Depression fast enough. And if you look at statistics, the real spike is going to be at World War II. And that FDR getting us into, and eventually saying we're going to be involved in World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that is what got us out of the Great Depression, and not the New Deal legislation, okay? That's something that requires more research on your part. I just want you to know that it's out there. I'm just trying to get you used to seeing a bunch of different perspectives, okay? We did an article called Catching Wild Pigs that I think you should check out on the back of your packet. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I think it's really interesting to see how governments sort of start to increase their power, and ultimately people are worried that the stronger the government is, the less freedoms you have. And of course, discussion for another day. Catching Wild Pigs is the article. And I always had this walking debate at the end, FDR's New Deal, was it a good thing for the country ultimately? And I hear all types of different stuff, but it's a question that I think you should be thinking about when we think of FDR, when we think of the New Deal. Was it good for us ultimately? A question to ponder going forward, okay? Anyway, thank you guys for listening to another video lecture. Hope this helps, and have a great day.